Now, I don't want to make too much of the differences within the different colonies, because to a large extent all of the immigrants were to some extent the same. They were mostly what we would consider now to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Northern Europe. At a minimum, they were almost entirely all Christian. They therefore had similar experiences and traditions. They had similar expectations. Many of them could read, many of them had similar religious beliefs, and the ones who could read were very much influenced by the tradition of Enlightenment thought. They even, to some extent, had very similar languages. And all of this affected the subsequent thought on what it meant to start a government. For example, those who were coming from Northern Europe had very distinct ideas of what it took to be able to influence opinions. They were influenced by what was known as the Enlightenment, which was going across Western Europe. This Enlightenment had some very interesting ideas, including the idea that government should be somehow accountable to the people it was governing, and more importantly, that people who had some level of education should be able to make their own decisions and would be able to determine what their own best interest was. There was a sense in which government should be able to be working for the best interests of the people. Many of these ideas were written down by different philosophers, including people like Montesquieu in France, as well as people like Montesquieu and Rousseau in France, as well as people like John Stuart Mill and John Locke, who you had to read for today. I asked you to read John Locke because it showed some of the ideas that very much were popular in the thought among England and the rest of sort of northwestern Europe. It doesn't mean that everybody necessarily read John Locke, although many people did. But it was certainly part of what sort of underlay the conversation around sitting around dinner tables and hanging out in restaurants. Much as today people might go out to restaurants and hang out and talk about popular television shows or maybe even talk about political debates. When people went out in the early 18th century, they would be talking about these types of ideas, these philosophies that were spreading across Europe. There are a couple of really important ideas that were contained in all of this. One of them was the idea that people should be able to govern themselves, but not necessarily everyone should be able to govern themselves. And there was a little bit of a sort of distinction being made. Just because you were an adult did not necessarily mean you were responsible enough to be able to have a say, but there were ways that you could prove that you were responsible. Two of the big ones that pretty much floated across all of Europe was if you had an education, be it you had some sort of law degree or you were a preacher or something like that, or if you had property. Both of these showed some level of responsibility, and both of these also showed some level of respectability within society. In addition, all of the Northern Europeans had some other ideas that had come to them as a result of changes in their own government. The English came from a tradition of having something called the Magna Carta, which was relatively unique in Europe even at this time. The Magna Carta, for the first time, put down the idea that the government should rule by the consent of the governed. Now, admittedly, the Magna Carta was very limited. The king still had all power, and when we talk about the idea of the consent by the governed, we were talking pretty much about nobles and people of wealth. However, the Magna Carta also enshrined some ideas which should be very familiar to us today. The idea of courts, which included trials by jury and due process, as opposed to having all decisions about right and wrong made arbitrarily by a king, is one of the crucial ideas in the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta also enshrined freedom of commerce, meaning trade, and also sort of set down the idea that there should be standard weights, measures, and monies across an entire country. The English also had, and also again this was relatively unique in Europe, Parliament, which meant that there were people who voted for representatives, and that within the Parliament itself, representatives voted to some extent to try to create the best idea for the nation. Parliament was a two-chambered structure, two-chambered legislature, and one chamber represented the nobility, the other chamber represented the common folk. Now, it's important not to make this sound too much like the American system, because it's important to realize that at this time, Parliament was still mostly governed by the nobility. The lower chamber, the common chamber, did not have much of a say. But Commons was gaining power even in the 1700s, and had already gotten to the point where any law passed by Parliament had to be subject to their approval. Parliament at this point had also gotten control of taxation, which meant that the nobility, and particularly the king, couldn't just pass a tax whenever he wanted to. In addition to this, the French had a couple of other ideas, which were certainly very popular among the British colonists at the time. One was written by a philosopher named Montesquieu, who had this idea that government should contain separate powers and have some sort of check and balance so that the legislature could also not govern, and so that the person who was actually enforcing the laws could not be the person who was writing them. In addition, a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France had the idea of a social contract and republican government, had the idea that, for example, in the idea of a social contract being that people should be able to sort of agree to give some of their power over to the government as long as the government promised to take care of them. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had also spent a lot of time in Switzerland and had spent a lot of time thinking about how wonderful it was to have a federated government. We'll talk about this later. All of these were very important because they wound up creating the idea, the currency which led the colonists eventually to think about where they were in position to the rest of the British citizens. The colonists, by the mid to late 18th century, 1700s, were beginning to feel that they were being treated unequally. The government in England was passing all kinds of laws about which they had very little say because they were so very far removed. They were worried about unequal treatment because they believed that they were entitled to equal treatment. They were complaining about taxation without representation because they believed that they had no representatives in Parliament to speak for them. And remember, they had a Parliament that did have a vote in the Commons. And they had a Parliament which did have control over taxation. So the idea that they would have no say was very problematic to them. In addition, they complained about the fact that their commerce was being very much destroyed by these taxes, and also by British regulations about who they could sell to and who they could buy from. This was then the result of the Stamp Acts, which was what the colonies were protesting. This then created the sort of groundwork after which emerged after rebellion. In 1776, after the colonists had, to the amazement of all the crowned heads in Europe, managed to overthrow the British yoke on the soil, they had now a completely new government and a completely new country. This hadn't happened for a very long time. They declared a republic, which was a virtually completely new form of government. With the exception of Switzerland, almost every country known to the Europeans were monarchies. And it's important to notice here that the idea of having government by the people, or at least with some sense of people's say, was a very scary thought. People had to distrust. They feared that the mobs would go out and rule, that there would be no orderly way in which all of these people who were now part of this new government would be able to sort of coherently form an opinion and enforce laws. This is perhaps not entirely surprising, given that the colonists had just created a rebellion, and rebellion is very upsetting. Around the world, very rarely do you see rebellions that then lead to some sort of cohesive government. Often sort of the rebels break into different factions. The new government had a number of different challenges. Existing states had pre-existing leadership, meaning that even in the case of a rebellion, you had some sense of who would be taking over next. There would be some other duke or earl or someone who would be ready to assume the crown. Not only that, but there was no pre-existing propertied class, no one with a lot of vested interests. What the colonies had at independence, which made them very different from Europe, was that they had a very large middle class, especially in sort of what we would call the Midwestern states now, and they had a lot of industry, especially in the north. This was very different from Europe, where you generally had a small handful of people who owned most of the property and the industry, and a large group of peasants who had very little property and mostly just worked for others. In addition, and this is perhaps interesting, there was no national church in the colonies. Most of the governments in Europe had a national church which could speak with some level of authority on major issues. You also had strong local alliances, which were sort of different because what you had were people who had very strong ties to their particular community and to their newly formed state or colony like Massachusetts or Maryland. And people had to make a conscious decision to move to a specific colony because they liked its government. This strange mix, then, is what was going on in people's minds as they sort of emerged from independence and tried to think through what they would be doing next. This is what forms the colonists' common heritage. This is what forms the colonists' common sense of where they should be going and how they should be behaving themselves. And I've been speaking thus far about a sort of broad group of people that I said have some significant differences within them, but are mostly from Northern Europe. It's important to realize that this is not the sum total of who is in these newly emerged colonies even then. And we can talk a little bit, we should think a little bit about who the other people are. At independence, even in 1776, in addition to all of these people who had come mostly from England, but also from Scotland and also from places like the Netherlands and some Germans and some French, you had a large population of Native Americans who were for the most part excluded from any say because they were considered savages. You also had a large number of people coming from Africa, who at that point were mostly slaves and mostly living in the South, although it's important to realize that there were freed Africans who fought in the Revolutionary War. They were mostly in the North. It's also important to realize that, like many other British colonies, the British did initially send criminals and orphans to the United States because they could not, their own prisons were overcrowded and their own orphanages were overcrowded. Australia is rather famous for this, but the United States also, at its independence, also had a little bit of this. And of course, much, much later, you start seeing groups coming from other areas as well. All of these people then form what becomes the basis of our government, but as I said, it's important to realize that not all of them necessarily had a say early on. One final note. I began our conversation today by pointing out that you had to be pretty strong-willed, independent, and somewhat courageous to want to make that very dangerous and harrowing journey from Northern Europe into the colonies. And that most people generally didn't do that unless they had some pretty strong reasons to want to make that journey. That generally people who had a really good social network, people who were doing fairly well in England, weren't going to make such a big risk. It's important to realize as we think about sort of the United States history and what happens in our political system, that immigration wasn't necessarily a one-time thing. That not only did people come from England to Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and so on, but as those colonies themselves began to get their own sort of regional governments and began to pass laws, people who discovered that they didn't particularly fit in with those laws continued to emigrate, sometimes to other colonies, sometimes founding new ones, but especially out west, which to some people it may explain why, when you look at sort of how the United States system works today, you tend to have a lot more people who tend to be a lot more worried about sort of making it on your own the farther west you go. That's not always true, of course, and every sort of generalization has large exceptions. What I hope you've gotten from today is a sense of what was in the colonists' minds, what was influencing how they thought, not only as they were agitating for their independence, but also what they were thinking about government as they started thinking about creating their own for the first time. Our next conversation will be about who they thought should be doing the governing. I'll talk to you then. Bye-bye.